Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Public Affairs Public Access. My name is Quentin Wiltz with the League of Women Voters Speakers Bureau, and I'll be your host for tonight's event. Tonight we have with us some very special guests, but first we want to thank the League of Women Voters Houston for presenting this, as well as Houston Media Source. So tonight we'll be focusing on Houston, disaster relief, flooding, and American Red Cross. And so we have some very distinguished guests with us this evening, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome them and also thank them for being here on such short notice. We really do appreciate you all being here and being able to share with us and our viewers pretty much what's going on. It's actually raining outside, so it kind of speaks to how important it is for people to get this information and to be able to use it to share with as many people that have been affected in the Houston region and area. So first I'd like to welcome Shakira Dennis with the Greater Houston Storm Relief Fund. Shakira is an advisory committee member. And I'd also like to welcome Mr. Neil McGurk with the American Red Cross. Neil is the Division Disaster Director. So welcome both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So first, I'd like to ask you, Shakira, so as far as the Houston Relief Fund, could you tell us a little bit about that?
So the Greater Houston Storm Relief Fund was developed. It's an initiative by Mayor Turner. He received an overwhelming outpouring of support from corporate entities and some of our neighbors here in Houston. And so he wanted to figure out a way to centralize those efforts and get them organized to make sure that the resources that were coming in would be adequately allocated to those who need it most.
Okay. And so in that, what role do you play?
I serve on the advisory committee, and so I'd be responsible for helping with the allocation process.
Okay, thank you. And Neil, if you could, so tell us a little bit about the Red Cross. I mean, you know, besides the shiny red cross and white background, you know, what's it all about? What is the Red Cross?
So the Red Cross is a global humanitarian movement. That's the way we like to think about it. It's not just an individual country, it's not just the community, it's really a global country. So there are Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations in just about every country across the globe, and we all operate under the same fundamental principles with the same humanitarian mission. In the United States, the American Red Cross, our focus is on a couple different things. You know, I've been with the Red Cross 9 years.
Okay.
When I started with the organization, I came in and I had the general understanding of what Red Cross did during big disasters, and I knew that we had activity with our, you know, with blood collection, blood donations. Absolutely. But I really learned the scope of what Red Cross was about and how interwoven the Red Cross is in individual communities. So. Across the country, we engage with blood supply, blood donations, blood products, getting those processed to hospitals. We have our health and safety programs, which are focused on first aid, CPR, aquatics, teaching, you know, lifeguard, how to swim courses, those types of things. Our programs that deal with called Service of the Armed Forces, which handles emergency communications and other services for our military members and their families. And then our international services, which is the link between our other organizations around the world. That we can help individuals that have been separated by disasters, by conflicts, help get emergency messages from refugee camps back to family members and help reconnect those individuals. And then the disaster services. And so one of the things that I find that a lot of people may not know about the Red Cross is that you see us sometimes on the news for the big disasters, like the flooding that's ongoing in Houston right now. But the number one disaster that we respond to is actually house fires. We respond to over 60,000 house fires annually within the United States. And that's happening in communities across the country. In every state and every community, we have teams of volunteers that are available 24/7, 365. And they are ready to respond at a moment's notice to respond out to the scene, generally when the fire department still is out there, and making sure that people have their basic humanitarian needs met. And that's what generally, when we go to a larger disaster, we're really looking at the same type of thing. We're focused on making sure that people have their basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter taken care of. That, when the house burns down, they're not stuck out on the street trying to find a place to sleep that night, that they have food, they have essential medications. And when the disaster gets larger, we do the same thing. So while it may not be an individual team out there at the scene at the curb, when you have 1,000 families that are impacted, we open up our emergency shelters, we provide feeding, we provide support, and then as the disaster as time goes on, we then work with community organizations to really help facilitate their overall recovery. So it really is, the way we talk about it on the Red Cross is we talk about it as a disaster cycle, where before the disaster, we really work to try to get people prepared for disaster, really facilitating individual preparedness. And then when the disaster happens, that's our response phase. That's, making sure people have shelter, they've got food, they have, those essential needs met. And then we really work with them to on the recovery side. And then the recovery leads right back into preparedness. And then we'll lead right back into response, recovery, preparedness, response, recovery. And so it really is a true cycle in any individual community. And unfortunately, Houston has been in that cycle several times this year, which has made it quite a unique event.
So, and I did want to point out one thing that I failed to mention is that, we invite our viewers to participate and call in if you have questions for any one of these great individuals that are here. You have their ear, so I suggest that you use it. And the number that you can call is 713-807-1794. So another bit of information. I encourage all our viewers to visit both the websites, it'd be redcross.org.
Correct.
And I think for the Houston, it's houstonrecovers.org as well. And so now, one thing I'd like to get back to is, Neil, you mentioned that it's a cycle, right? Could you at least elaborate for us when there is a disaster, what steps are taken, and kind of walk us through that, right? So, in particular in Houston, right? There's flooding, and a family or multitude of families have been displaced. They've lost everything, and then what happens, right?
So, on the response side, the way that works is it starts months before that. So the Red Cross is made up of our primary workforce. The vast majority of our workforce, over 90%, is made up of volunteers. And so it's engaging people in the community to come out and to get trained in advance to operate shelters, to work in a variety of different activities, so that when a disaster happens, we can call those volunteers into place and they can help support their community. So in this instance, in these last instances where we've had this flooding in Houston, we've generally had a little bit of notice. A couple days in advance, we've known there's going to be a heavy rainfall. Now, in some of these circumstances, the rain was in different areas, or the rain was a lot heavier than was forecasted. But the way that we operate is that when we know that there's going to be a potential flood event, we're going to be in communication with the City of Houston, with Harris County, with other organizations, really to see what their assessment of the situation is, and then to see if we can ready our volunteers, ready our shelter facilities, so that if flooding does happen, we already have resources ready to go that we can push out immediately. Mm-hmm. So the way that this will generally work is that in a flooding situation, local emergency management, local police, local fire department are responsible for rescues. They do the search and rescues. They call for the, local officials will call for evacuations, and that's when they'll turn to the Red Cross to really help coordinate and deal with the population that's been impacted. So what we do in that circumstance is we'll then coordinate with the city, coordinate with the county, and try to identify a facility nearby outside of a danger zone with which we can open up a shelter. And so once we open that shelter, we'll coordinate with other organizations to try to get those people bused or however transported to that shelter. And then when we open that shelter, we try to have a variety of services available for people. So in addition to general feeding, making sure we have food available for people, we want to make sure they have medical care. And this is general, basic medical care. It's not hospital medical care, but it's medical care to make sure that someone, obviously if they've evacuated very quickly, they may have left their life-sustaining medications, any sort of medical equipment, walkers, other types of durable medical equipment. We want to make sure they have those supplies. And then we also have trained counselors there, because if you can imagine, a lot of these rain events have happened in the middle of the night. And I know, back during the Memorial Day flood, last year, back in 2015, our local CEO in Houston, his home was flooded. And he told me the story about how he had to carry his kids on his back to their neighbor's house that had a second floor because water had rushed in at like 2 a.m. in the morning. That story is not unique. It's a story that people have of water coming in, of creeping in or rushing in very quickly, and that could be very traumatic. So we have to make sure that we're not just taking care of and making sure that someone has a place to stay and food and clothing. We want to make sure that they're emotionally taken care of as well, because disasters are very traumatic. Oftentimes people get, when they're affected by a disaster, it's the first time they've been affected by a disaster. Unfortunately, in Houston, several of these families have been impacted time and time again, which can be, again, re-traumatizing. So we really focus on a variety of needs, but really making sure that people have access to that emotional care as well, which may go overlooked during the initial rush to get people out of harm's way.
So something that I kind of want to lead into, when you say actually putting people in shelters, some of that may possibly lead to fees. I mean, it doesn't come at non-expense. It's not free. And I kind of want to tie into the relief fund, because obviously Red Cross allocates certain resources to be able to house people, but I think there's maybe grant monies available or funds available. So if you can kind of elaborate on that, Shakira.
Sure. So the fund is currently at close to $1.8 million. And so we have entities such as the United Way and Catholic Charities who've done a very fine assessments of what the needs are currently for those people who have been displaced by the flood. Our process is pretty simple. We would submit an RFP. The United Way will be facilitating the entire process in conjunction with the Greater Houston Community Foundation. So we're looking for organizations who are interested in providing immediate and short-term needs to those residents who have been affected. And we are in a position to allocate the necessary resources to ensure that they're able to do that.
Okay. So how does that work with FEMA? I mean, obviously, you're working with Red Cross, United Way. How does FEMA play a role in all this?
So FEMA currently, the fund has paid for FEMA to have space near the Greenspoint area, where we realized that there was like heavy pockets of folks who had been displaced and affected by the flood. So we basically supplement their efforts, especially their case management efforts. They don't have the capacity to cover every family and meet every need. And so our resources would go towards supplementing FEMA's efforts and assisting them as well.
So how many families are we talking about? I mean, would you happen to give an idea of how many families directly you've been working with in both, just to give our viewers an idea of the scale and the magnitude of what this flooding has done to this area?
So what I can say is across the state, and I'll get down into Harris County information, we have, for the past 12 months, we've had 9 major flood events. These are not small flood events. These are 9 major flood events within the state.
So what constitutes a major flood event versus a...
Typically where you have maybe over 100 to 200 families that are impacted.
Okay.
And so in this situation, statewide, we've assisted over 9,000 families.
Okay.
And in the Houston area, it's been around 3,000 to 4,000 families. But again, that was from the last flood event. A lot of those, we have several families have been impacted twice, 3 times by flooding events. But it is several thousand families that have been impacted around the Houston area multiple times.
And when this 1.8 million?
Yes.
Right? Right, 1.8, I'm trying to keep that in my mind. 1.8 million. So the funds are obviously in the process of being allocated. People have to apply. What's the process? I mean, if I want to apply for these funds, what do I have to do?
Sure. So the United Way will send out an RFP, meaning a request for an RFP. And so if you're an organization that's interested in, possibly receiving funding, you would adhere to the RFP process that the United Way will be facilitating. And the Greater Houston Community Foundation is solely responsible for allocating those resources once approved by the United Way.
Okay, so, and I'm going to go forward and then probably come back, but
Sure.
Let's say, all the process has been completed, the people that need help have been helped. What do you do with the funds after they've been allocated, if there's any money left over?
We're going to keep the fund active and operable, and so we're going to hold those monies for future disaster relief efforts. I think that's the best use, and the mayor has made that very clear that he definitely wants to leave some money there to make sure that if this does happen again, we're adequately ready financially, to assist those residents who've been affected.
So it's a committee, so we know that there are multiple people on this committee. Could you maybe go into some detail as to either who's on the committee, who chairs the fund, or?
Absolutely. So the fund is chaired by local businessman and community leader Anthony Chase, and so it's a breadbasket of civic leaders, businessmen and women, and folks from the nonprofit community.
Okay. Now, how does the Red Cross, like I said before, we understand that there's a lot of resources that are required, a lot of volunteer power. So where does the funding come from for the Red Cross?
The American people. Yeah, it does. I mean, that's another misconception about the Red Cross, is that we receive, an allocation from the federal government on a regular basis, and that's not true.
Right.
We're funded through the generosity of the American people, and that's really why it's so challenging in these responses. We've had response after response after response, and sometimes there's what we call sort of donor fatigue, where they see disaster after disaster, but from us, we're driven by our humanitarian mission to make sure that everybody has access to Red Cross and other services as well, and so and it takes that generosity of the American people and the citizens of Harris County that haven't been impacted to make those donations. All Red Cross services are free. So while it does cost us to run shelters and to train volunteers and to provide assistance to families, the assistance that families receive is without strings and is 100% free.
Wow. So when you say the funding of American people, I mean, obviously it's not just from people in this region. The funds come from all over to a central, and then they're dispersed out to the different areas, correct?
So we actually have a nationwide disaster relief fund. And the reason why we encourage people to donate to the Disaster Relief Fund is because there's a lot of disasters that don't make big news. It's the house fires, 60,000 house fires, but then also smaller floods, smaller tornadoes. Sure. We all hear about the Hurricane Sandys and the Moore Oklahomas and the Hurricane Katrinas and those big disasters that make a lot of news. But it's the vast majority of disasters outside of the house fires that we respond to they may make the regional news for a couple days, and then the coverage goes elsewhere. And so we encourage people to donate to that disaster relief fund, because that's where we get the funds to be able to pay for those medium-scale disasters that impact frequently across the country.
So now, when we talk about the Houston area flooding, how does this disaster relief compare to the others that the Red Cross, American Red Cross, have been involved in throughout the U.S. and other areas?
So what I can say is from my experience, and I've been with the organization for 9 years, this is the most, it's not the biggest disaster that we've responded to, and it's not the biggest disaster that I've responded to, but what makes it unique is that it's the duration. And it's one event after another event after another event. I mentioned we've had 9 major floods, and that's just the floods. That's not including the tornadoes and the wildfires and other things that have happened. We've had 9 major floods in the past 12 months. That's a significant event, and it's the most disaster events that I've experienced in my tenure at the Red Cross. And so that makes it, if you add it all together, it's a very large event. They're large events by themselves, but they're very large events if you look at it from a 12-month perspective. And so that's why we need, in order to be able to respond to the next event, we need more volunteers. We need more individuals to get engaged as the Red Cross, either through their time or through their donations or whatever it happens to be, because the other thing that I'm thinking, always in the back of my head, it's June 2nd. Yesterday was the first day of hurricane season, and I don't know what hurricane season holds for us. And us being down here on the coast in a vulnerable position, we have to be ready for hurricane season. And so always trying to make sure that when we're responding to this disaster, we're always looking forward and planning for that next disaster as well, and trying to get the community engaged, because we know, Houston's been hit several times in the past month alone. I don't know what's going to happen in 2 weeks. I don't know what's going to happen in 4 weeks. And so we have to make sure that when we're responding to this, we also keep our plans ready for the next disaster that would inevitably impact the Houston area.
So, with so much recurring disasters, what areas would you say the Red Cross is in most need of as far as resources? Obviously, you mentioned earlier finances or funds and donor fatigue. So, you laugh, Shakira.
It's a real circumstance. I mean, donor fatigue is real.
Yeah. So when you talk about resources, and I'll plug it again.
Sure.
Redcross.org.
Redcross.org, and the easiest way, and I'll plug this, the easiest way to make a donation is to text Red Cross to 90999, and that comes out to a $10 donation. We encourage people to make those kinds of those texts. It's quick, it's easy. It's text Red Cross to 90999, and that will give a donation into the Red Cross. But I also want to encourage people to volunteer. And this is what, and you're going to get me, you've got me up on my platform here, because I'm very passionate about it, because there are a variety of ways to engage with the Red Cross. If you want to train somebody, if you want to be a teacher, if you want to help reconnect families that have been separated through conflict around the globe, if you want to serve food to a family that's been displaced by a flood, if you want to make sure a family has a safe place to stay that's just had their house burned down. These are activities that we have on a regular basis here in Houston, and we always need more volunteers. We need more volunteers to get trained in sheltering, to help shelter those folks, and we need more volunteers on what we call our disaster action team. And our disaster action team is the team that responds to those house fires and those apartment fires. And while we've been responding to these floods, since May 26th, when the rain really started to move through the area, we've responded to 16 house fires within the Houston area, and we've helped 61 individuals. And those are all done by volunteers that will get up at either 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning and go out and help people that are on the curb waiting for assistance.
So the volunteers that you do have right now, Houston obviously covers many different parts, and there's obviously a lot of areas that have been affected, Meyerland, Greens Point. What areas right now do you think has taken up a lot of your resources in the Houston area? Which area can you say you can pinpoint?
Well, several weeks ago, our main hit area was the Greens Point area. And so that's where we had the apartment complexes that were heavily damaged and impacted, and a lot of people had to move and relocate out of those areas. This area, it's sort of along Spring Creek, in the sort of the north central part of the county, and then up in Kingswood as well, in that general area up in the northeast side. We're also concerned because we have more rain coming in, and I was driving in and I was seeing the high levels of the bayous, and getting more concerned. There's just not a lot. Our watersheds in here from San Jacinto and then further to the west to the Brazos, we can't accept a lot more rain. There's just not a lot of places for this to go. And so while we're responding, we have a shelter open in Harris County in Houston right now. We're in the process of potentially opening another one in the northeast part of the county, where we're currently working with local City of Houston and with the Harris County to identify the best location for that facility. But we're also getting ready for additional rain, making sure we have additional resources to open up additional shelters. So far, we're looking at several hundred homes within Harris County in this last disaster that have been impacted, but that number could go dramatically up if we have additional heavy rainfall.
So now with the relief fund, we talk about resources, and I think there was a concert or something, right?
Yes.
That was. Could you kind of go into some of those details?
So the Special Events Office, within the Mayor's office, decided to organize an effort, led obviously by Clay Walker. He decided to donate his service, which of course is his gift. And a few other artists all came together and decided to do a benefit concert, which all the funds directly went to the Greater Houston Storm Relief Fund. And we thank Pastor Joel Osteen and Victoria Osteen for opening up Lakewood Church to house that benefit concert. It was huge, and we raised a great deal of money. And we are able to, help those individuals who are displaced with rental supplements, their basic needs, food, water, medical services and equipment and things of that nature. And so, it really does go a long way, and we're thankful to those Houstonians for their generosity.
Do you think with some of the things that are going on now that we potentially could see another concert?
I mean, I don't know about another concert. I mean, I won't overstep, but I mean, I'm sure there'll be some generous Houstonians, as there have been, thus far, which pretty much prompted, the development of the fund. And so none of this would be possible without entities like the Hess Corporation, Laura and John Arnold Foundation, Gringos. I mean, you have many others, the Rockets, who donated $500,000 easily, right? And so you think about, those in the business community who thought enough to give some resources for the fund.
So if I'm a resident in Houston and I'm worried about being displaced, what should I do?
Well, the number one thing is, if you're concerned about being displaced, if you feel unsafe, then you really need to talk to the police department, the fire department, to identify if you are in an area of that's at risk. If you have been told to evacuate, then you need to evacuate. You can find There's a couple different ways that you can get assistance and find a way and find a safe shelter within your area. The first one is that you can either go onto our website. You can do this on the mobile app, is on your smartphone as well. Go to redcross.org, and there's a little button there about Find a Shelter that will pop up with all the open emergency shelters for individuals that have been impacted by disasters. The other way is to actually call us directly, and that's 866-526-8300. Again, that's 866-526-8300. But the most important thing is that if your area is under evacuation, you need to evacuate. Don't wait. Don't say and try to see if it'll get better. You need to listen to authorities and to evacuate an area.
So, and with the relief fund, people, I think maybe some people have heard that they were using the funds. They were provided some shelter opportunities that were outside of the Red Cross shelters, maybe a hotel or some other things, right? And then what happens when those funds they no longer will pay for that? What do you do?
I mean, for us, we've already supplemented, we pretty much took care of the bill from the hotels, and the majority of those individuals who are displaced are now back in their actual units.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I don't know.
Well, the reason is because I've read in certain places that there have been some people who have had some problems getting back, and due to registration or some other things. So, what do you do in that instance as far as the Red Cross?
So, in addition to our sheltering, one thing that we offer and then we try to engage is our casework process. Mm-hmm. And our casework process is designed, and especially trained caseworkers come in, they sit down with the families and they work with them on their recovery plans. And oftentimes people are going to have barriers to their recovery. And this is why it's important to understand that in emergency response and disaster relief, it's not just one organization or different organizations working independently. It's everyone working together. So the Red Cross, what we focus on is, again, that sheltering situation and the casework situation, and really taking care of people that we call emergency needs, their basic human needs, to make sure they have, enough assistance to be able to get through the next coming days and the weeks. Then we're going to be, as our casework process, we gather that information, and we're going to be working with other organizations that can help meet those longer-term needs. So the longer-term housing needs, the longer-term job needs, the longer-term transportation needs. Mm-hmm. And so that's where each family's meeting with an individual caseworker or a team of caseworkers that can then work with the city, work with other organizations, other nonprofits, other charities, to help identify strategies to get them to a point where they can then be self-sustaining, where they can move back into an apartment, where they have a job, where they have transportation to get to that job. And it is a complicated and long drawn-out process. So the recovery side is not something that comes, response is never, it's not a cookie-cutter shape where, okay, we're a week here and then 2 weeks for recovery and then we're good. Recovery, especially for large disasters, can take years. To get people and get a community back on its feet. So we're in the very early stages of the Greens Point area flood several weeks ago, and then we're still in the response phase of the current ongoing flooding in Houston. But this will be something that we as a community are going to be dealing with for quite a bit in the future.
Okay. Now I believe we have a call, so we'd like to take a call now.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to call in and ask a question. I hear the need for volunteers and donations. I don't have a lot of time or money to give, but I am curious, what is it I can be doing for my family to help them prepare and be ready when this happens?
Okay. So I don't know if you caught that.
Yes,
All
I
right.
did. Well, the number one thing, we talked about that disaster cycle, about preparedness, response, and recovery. And we at the Red Cross, and I know the City of Houston and other organizations do this, we really are trying to engage people in building individual preparedness. So that's a question of, if a disaster would happen today, do you have an emergency kit at your house? What does that emergency kit contain? Do you have water? Do you have supplies? Do you know if you had a major disaster that occurred without any notice within Houston, and you were separated from your family when that disaster happened? Do you have a plan to get back in contact with that family?
So you mentioned, and I want you to continue to elaborate, but when you mention emergency kit, what are some essentials that I should have in my emergency kit?
Well, it's going to be different for each disaster that is faced, but you need to basically have basic supplies, basic food to get you through 72 hours. So again, I'm not asking you guys to build a big kit, a bunker in your basement for this horrible event, but it's basic things. So at my house, I've got I've got a kit, and it has drinking water, it has some protein bars. I have my flashlight. I have a little first aid kit, some work gloves, and then a crank radio. And the crank radio also has my little cell phone plug-in thing where I can keep my phone charged as well. It's basic stuff, and that's important, because if a major disaster were to happen, where there's a lot of different chaos going on within the city, people are going to have to take it upon themselves to make sure that they have that kind of care, while the organizations can come in and set up shelters, and while the city can come in and try to restore services. But a good, well-prepared community relies on that individual preparedness.
I'm not sure if the caller's still on the line or not, but no, thank you for calling in. We appreciate it. No, so those are always good points, right? Because you mentioned, especially with Greens Point, how we're at the very early stages, right? And recovery phase can take a long time. What's the time frame? I mean, obviously, the different disasters will determine the severity of a lot of the damage that's done. But in past experience, what has been, I guess, a baseline of a recovery time period?
I'll tell you, it's really difficult to say. There's a lot of different factors that come into play. I think on this disaster, some of the things that come into play that bode well for the individuals that have been affected by this flood is the community response, is the engagement of a lot of donors and a lot of interest to help individuals on those paths to recovery. But it is not in any disaster, it's not a quick process. If you take it just from the individual perspective, we still have people that from the Memorial Day flood that are still rebuilding homes. And so their individual recovery is still ongoing. We're still rebuilding neighborhoods, and some of those neighborhoods flooded 3-4 weeks ago down in the Meyerland area again. And so it really is, it's difficult to say how long the recovery process is going to take. I know some disasters, it's taken years. I know up in the Northeast, they're still recovering from Hurricane Sandy. They're still recovering in areas from Hurricane Katrina. I mean, this is ongoing disasters, and so the recovery process can take long, which is why we talk about it, not to use a cliche, but it is a marathon, and we as a community have to approach it in that sense, to realize that it's not something that we're going to be able to flip a switch. It's going to take a long, continued effort, and that's what I think is great about Houston and Harris County, is there are the organizations willing to put in that time to have a good, proper recovery.
So, and you mentioned recovery, and in the last couple of days we've been getting flood warnings. Are you able to speak on other organizations or entities, City of Houston or any other, that would allow you to maybe hint that the flood control is being addressed or are being fixed?
So what I can say is that no, I don't. So when we, from my perspective, what our focus is taking care of individuals.
Okay.
And so when people are flooded, we're going to be there. So other issues are outside of our purview, but our main priority is wherever people are affected, we want to be there, right there at the moment that they're impacted to provide that assistance.
Now, something else, right? So we mentioned recovery period. When does Red Cross, when do you say, even with the relief fund, and we talk about having funds left over, but when do you say job complete? When's Red Cross done? When can we turn it over and say, oh, you know, that's it? Or
It's again, that's difficult to say. So I'll tell you, we have when we have a disaster, the visible component of our stuff, you know, where we have our vehicles that are out delivering meals and things like that. That's several weeks after disaster, and then you stop to see our presence. That does not mean that we aren't working with long-term recovery committees and unmet needs committees, which are committees that are formed to help identify down to the family level what are some barriers that people are having for those unmet needs. And that's happening in communities across Texas and across the country right now in disaster-impacted areas. And so the important thing is that response is very visual. You see the fire trucks, you see, you know, the shelters, you see the feeding going on and the distributing of supplies. Recovery happens in the background. And there is no, it's not a matter of, okay, we're going to stand and say the job is done. The job is done when the community has recovered. And that's going to be different for each and individual community. And so it is, but it's not something that's announced.
so, I mean, obviously when people's homes are flooded, there's a lot of debris. I mean, is there any advice you can give to getting rid of that? I mean, those are memories, but you know, at some point with all those homes, when Red Cross is trying to get to people in need, the debris can become a hindrance. So
Sure.
do you have some suggestions as to how to deal with that?
So when a disaster happens and you have that debris in the area, the city or the county or the local jurisdiction has a responsibility, and they'll actually, before they allow people to come back into an area, they'll generally clear the roads of debris to allow for ingress and egress of populations going in there. For people cleaning up debris, because people go back into their house, there's a couple different things that we try to do. We try to give them supplies that will help them clean up. And so this is where we're distributing relief supplies across the area. And I think in the last floods, we distributed over 100,000 individual relief items within Harris County alone. And in the past 12 months, we've distributed over 500,000 relief items, shovels, boxes of trash bags, those types of things. Again, to give people the items that they need to be able to start cleaning up their homes, to take out those things and try to salvage their memories as best as possible. The other thing that we want to have out there, that we work to have out there, is to have our counselors out there. You can imagine, if you've been living in your home with your family, you've amassed a lifetime worth of memories, and to come back in and to see that covered in mud. Again, is also a traumatic experience. And so when the people are ripping everything out and piling things on the curb, that is hard for people. And it's hard for people, you know, in the coming days when they realize now they're in a new apartment or they're in a shelter or in a hotel and they have nothing. They have nothing but the clothes on their backs. And so during the cleanup process, we try to be very sensitive to the needs, the physical needs they have in order to clean up their homes, but also their emotional needs. To make sure that they're taken care of to get them through that traumatic experience.
When we talk about those experiences, and how would I go about donating locally? I mean, we mentioned the website, but I mean, is there something I can do or bring or locally to donate to help?
So I'll tell you, we really encourage monetary donations during disasters. I'll tell you, the City of Houston and Harris County, the citizens here are very generous with giving. But when we have a disaster, what we find is that monetary donations are best because that allows, this is not just for the Red Cross, and I won't speak to a specific organization, but to other organizations as well. Monetary donations are best because that allows the organization to give individuals items that they need specifically. And I'll take this back to, I'm gonna go back a long time, back to the I have this story from the 1900 Galveston storm.
Okay.
And that was Clara Barton was our founder. It was her
Yep.
last major disaster, was the Galveston storm. And she wrote in her book that they were receiving a lot of these donations from around the country, a lot of item donations. And one of the donations she received was over 100 left shoes. And 100 left shoes that obviously we couldn't do anything with. The organization couldn't give those out. But those are the types of things that I know the generosity people have this desire to give, and it's absolutely wonderful. But monetary donations allow organizations to be able to go and procure the items at lower costs. That way we can get those items quickly into the hands of people that need them, like shovels, tarps, rakes, those types of things. And when we buy it in bulk, it allows that dollar to go further.
So I'm a volunteer. I want to volunteer. Could you maybe explain the process of what it would take? How long? What is it specifically? Because you mentioned some different areas to volunteer that the Red Cross is looking for to be able to help in times of need. So what would a volunteer expect as far as training, resources,
Sure.
et cetera?
So at the Red Cross, we have volunteer opportunities for everybody. We've got people who, are jazzed to get up at 3 a.m. and go out there and run out to the scene of a house fire. We have people that don't want to do that, that want to, come into the office and do a little bit of work. We have people that want to work at home and volunteer from home. There are opportunities for everybody. And the way the process works is you go online, you fill out a basic, quick application. That gets sent to the local chapter, which would be Houston here. And then someone from our Office of Volunteers will then call and try to identify what best program that you would be a best fit in, where your interests lie. And then there's training. There's online training that we have for people that you can do from home. There's also some in-class training as well. And then that gives you the tools and resources you need in order to be able to respond or do whatever kind of activity that you have. And this is, the role of our paid employees is to support the volunteers. And our volunteers can either be workers in a shelter or they can be senior leaders within the organization. And that's what's the great thing about Red Cross. Volunteers are not just treated as a tool with which to accomplish or to do a job. Volunteers are really empowered to be able to lead an overall response and to be able to take action and to run a shelter or to drive one of our emergency response vehicles to go deliver supplies and meals and those types of things. There are activities for any level of interest, any amount of time. If you want to volunteer an hour, if you want to give 10,000 hours, there are opportunities at the Red Cross for you.
Now, we hinted at it a little bit earlier, but are you partnered with the Relief Fund with certain churches or areas here that...
So if you're looking to give food and or hydration donations, you obviously would go to the Houston Food Bank. But if you are a resident in need of, receiving resources, you would go to Loving Word Fellowship Church. And so that's where any resident who's been displaced or is in need of assistance could go there and receive any of those items. And also Constable Alan Rosen has been so gracious to open up his office as well to take other items such as toiletries, etc. And so all of that can be found on HoustonRecovers.org. And also if some folks don't have time to donate or don't have time to go to any of those drop-off sites, you could just make a financial contribution.
So, and maybe we've touched on this before, but what are some of the current areas of need of those that have been affected? Could you speak to that?
Obviously, the fund is covering rental vouchers for those who have been displaced. Folks have had their vehicles damaged, so we're covering that. Obviously, basic needs again, food, water, toiletries, things of that nature. So those are some of the areas that we're currently covering.
Okay. Now, kind of going back, right? So we've had these issues come up again and again, and typically when things happen over and over, you're able to either respond faster, you're able to do so more efficiently because you've seen it before, right? So what are some lessons learned that maybe you can share with us specifically here in the Houston area, or maybe some other areas that you've had to address that going forward can make this a little bit easier for those displaced or those in need?
I would say number one is the importance of the integration of the faith-based community within the overall response to make sure that we have access that we can reach out and get into those communities.
So are you actively partnering with those organizations
yes.
now?
Yes, yeah. And we have had those partnerships. I think it really just spurs the need as we were getting to the Greens Point area. And then there were some other areas as well to try to engage the faith-based community. By engaging with the faith-based community, it ensures that that no one gets left behind. That's always my concern in any kind of large disaster, is that I'm always concerned about there might be a neighborhood or a couple houses that might not have seen anybody. And so by engaging with community organizations and with faith-based organizations to try to identify if any members of their congregations have been impacted, that way we can go and identify and make sure that everybody has access to Red Cross services or any services in general. The other thing, sort of a lesson learned that has been a challenge, is learning more about where some of the bayous and the creeks are going to flood. Where are the really prone areas now? Because with additional growth, every 5 years, the areas that flood may be a little bit different. So it always is going to change just a little bit. And so trying to make sure that we have pre-positioned resources in those targeted hazardous areas, make sure we have shelters, what we call on standby, ready to go at the time, in those strategic locations. We've been able to do that over the last 12 months since the first flood back right before Memorial Day. And we've been able to then hone in on where are our most susceptible areas for flooding ever since then.
Those are always good. I know you touched on making sure no one gets left behind, because sometimes we tend to focus on the heaviest hit, the most televised, or those areas. So there are people that are affected outside of those areas. So that it's good that you mentioned being able to touch on all those different resources. And so if you had an opportunity to leave our viewers with the most pertinent bit of information, I want to make sure we get that out. So what would you want to make sure you get across in this segment to our viewers?
The number one thing is that the Red Cross services are free and they're open to anyone. There are no qualifiers. You just have to be impacted by the disaster. That's the most important thing. And so, and to help spread the word that if you know of a relative, a neighbor, a coworker that's been impacted, or that knows somebody that's been impacted, we really want individuals to call the 866 526-8300. And you can go to redcross.org. You can get that information as well. That will help get you in. So we know where you are, we know how you've been impacted, and that will help get you in to other networks and try to engage you with other organizations that may be able to also assist with your recovery.
And the same thing with the Relief Fund.
I would say always remain prepared. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. As Neil mentioned earlier, having that kit at home, is extremely helpful. But also making sure that you're equipping your friends, families, and peers with the necessary information to remain abreast of all services that are available for anyone who has been affected. Because a lot of times, folks are a little, fatigued, and it's a traumatic experience. And so when it comes to the case management process, it's almost our only way of knowing, what's going on with each individual family and how we can identify best ways and best practices on meeting those needs. And so our deal would be to remain engaged, make sure that you're diligent and that you're patient with the case management process. It's not easy. It's, you're dealing with tons of people who've been affected by a natural disaster, and you want to make sure that everyone gets the support that they need. And so I think remaining engaged and also visiting HoustonRecovers.org and learning where some of those drop-off places are if you want to help, and also if you've been affected, what you can do to make sure that you get the resources that you need.
No, those are some very good points. And I'm listening to you and thinking about some major events that are coming up. So next year, Houston, we'll have something called a Super Bowl here, right? And so we know that there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people, a lot of areas that are going to be impacted. So as the Relief Fund and those people involved in the committee, as well as the Red Cross and other organizations, are plans being made in advance to perhaps prepare in case something does happen before, to make sure that we make this area as accessible as possible?
So I have not. I can guarantee you this. That yes, plans. Plans are well underway. It's not going. We're not going to wake up the day before. I think we have to have a plan. No, I'll guarantee you. The plans are well underway. That's not my area. That I have not been working directly on that. But I was when I was working on the Super Bowl plan up in North Texas in Arlington several years ago. Those plans started years, like 3-4 years before, to make sure that things are well prepared for and well checked.
So now you mentioned shelters here, right? And I know you obviously have an area that you cover. Is because of the recent disasters here, has Red Cross thought about maybe centralizing a location in the Houston area? I mean, you said earlier you were in you're home based in Dallas, correct?
Correct.
And
yeah.
National Red Cross office is where?
Is in Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So, you have a disaster-prone area, obviously. You said 9,000 families or something.
Around the state.
Around the state.
Yeah.
So this area is obviously one of a concern. So is there any plans to maybe move or centralize some efforts directly here in Texas?
Yeah, so we do have, I am based in Dallas, but I sort of oversee our programs within Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. But we do have dedicated Red Cross employees and Red Cross facilities throughout the state and throughout the country. And so we do have a facility here. Our local chapter office is on Southwest Freeway. We have another office up in Spring. We've got other offices around the greater Houston area, and that's where individuals can come and be their home base for their volunteers and for our other employees that support those volunteers. But as far as shelters go, Red Cross, we partner with other organizations to operate shelters, and so we have, right now within Harris County, we've got 62 locations for where we have emergency shelters. Now, those aren't all open at this time. Those are schools, those are churches, and based on the disaster, we will try to identify the best facility that will open, that's nearest to that disaster. When we operate emergency services, we always try to make sure that these services are in a way that are accessible to the affected population. So if we've got something in a disaster in Tomball, we don't open a shelter in Pasadena. We try to find something clear up in that area that will be accessible to those individuals. Because when people are staying in shelters, they also still need to be able to get to work and to get their kids to school. Life doesn't stop. You have to be able to continue that because that's going to help you get on with your recovery. So we partner with churches, we partner with the city, with the county to identify facilities, other private organizations to try to find facilities large enough to be able to handle shelters. And so that's really our network. So we don't have a network of Red Cross-owned facilities. It's really engaging the community with which to operate shelters.
So, and you mentioned the schools. During these relief efforts, were any schools utilized, gymnasiums or anything like that? Or did you stick to strictly maybe more private or commercial?
It's a combination. I have to go back. I don't have it right on the top of my head over the last couple of how many disasters, of how many shelters were in schools versus churches within the city of Houston and Harris County. But across the board, we do a combination of schools and churches. Now, the challenge, though, is when we operate school shelters, is that school has to continue at some point.
Exactly. Well, that's what I was getting at. Yeah, right.
And so it becomes a challenge. So you have to understand how big the disaster is. And then, if you're, disrupting school services, then what kind of effect does that have on the community as well? If people that have been impacted, they're trying to go back to school, but they can't, trying to go back to work, but they can't go back to work because they don't have child care and the schools aren't open, then that becomes a hindrance to their overall recovery. So these are all things that we have to come and really look at and work with the city and the county and other organizations to try to find what is the best solution for the sheltering needs of that community.
Oh, so those are all good points, and I do want to take this opportunity to really thank both of the guests here. I want to say that it was very last minute, and they responded on very short notice, and so we appreciate you coming here and sharing with us a little bit about the organizations that you represent, what you do, how that affects Houston directly, and what's being done currently to utilize, and the people that are utilizing those services. So we really do appreciate it. And on behalf of the League of Women Voters Houston, as well as Houston Media Source, I do want to thank all our viewers for tuning in, and I hope you found this session very helpful. We always want to reach out to those in need and keep it on our minds that just because we don't see it directly, that people are still being affected. And as Neil mentioned, these efforts go on long beyond the time that we see them on TV or that we read about them in the papers, because people's lives are continually affected. So again, we appreciate you all here and thank our viewers at home. On behalf of the League of Women Voters Houston and Houston Media Source, we thank you for tuning in to this session of Public Affairs, Public Access.